All right. So, welcome back again. Tonight we'll talk a little bit about 850 overall and talk a little bit about the 2 news stories that I sent out to you all around alcoholism in the US. We'll kind of do a little bit of a review of some of the foundational concepts in statistics and then orient ourselves a bit to the survey data. And talk a little bit about what we have and the next steps for that. Anything else that you all want me to cover tonight, or other lingering questions from 850 or anything like that?
I have a question about getting the SPSS software. Is there a how-to? Because I Googled it, but it's kind of hard to figure out. I don't think I found the right thing.
Are you talking about the VLab or just buying SPSS?
Buying
it. So I would do the grad pack, and I think I can probably send you a couple of websites where you can buy that and just download it. Okay. The one that I bought mine on last year. I'll pull together a couple of websites and post those for you guys.
Okay, because I found one, but I didn't see a grad pack option, and I was like, I don't know if I'm looking at the right thing.
Yeah, I'll post that tonight.
Thank you.
Has anybody started working with VLab or tried VLab at all? No? All right. If you want to try VLab, and see how that works for you, and let me or ideally IT know if you have any questions. You can let me know, but I may not be able to answer them. IT may not be able to answer them either, but hopefully they will be better suited to do that than I will. And I'll post some websites where you can buy SPSS as well. All right. So yeah.
I'm sorry. I was trying to
go ahead.
Background noise went away. I wanted to know, for the SPSS grad pack, is the premium better than the standard? What do we really need?
Yeah, let me look. I'm guessing you're probably going to be fine with standard, but let me just double check the list of things that are on that and make sure.
And then also, is it better to buy the 6-month or the year?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on when you think you're going to be heading into dissertation. So if you're going to be, so for many of you, you'll do comps this semester or in the spring semester and then start over the summer. So you probably won't need SPSS again for several semesters. So I would say probably stick to the 6-month one for now and then buy it again later. But that's kind of up to you all. Yeah, because if you buy it now, you'll definitely be good for all of this class, and then you'll have some time in between as you're writing your proposal, because the first part is really just writing and doing lit review and that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's a good question. All right, so let's talk about 851, and obviously jump in if you have questions or anything. So the textbook, I had given you all the information about the textbook in our weekend of 850, but it's statistics for people who think they hate statistics. Clever. It's the 6th edition. I haven't compared the 6th edition to the 5th edition. It's always a question I get, is if you can use the 6th edition or the 5th edition, early edition. My response to that is always at your own risk. I can't sit and compare them and figure out what's different and what's missing. So if you want to do that, that's up to you. I would just say it's at your own risk. So that is the textbook. And I uploaded, I think I did it this semester too, but I'll double check that. The Palant, I don't know how to say that name, the SPSS survival guide. So you have the online version of that, the PDF version of that, and So the readings that I assign out of that are a little bit more of the how-to, the kind of step-by-step for SPSS. And that book also does a little bit of description of kind of like why would you use this, when would you use this, that kind of stuff, but it's also the sort of how-to for SPSS. So I know I uploaded that for 850, and I think I've done it for 851, but I'll double check. And then any other readings that I have in there, I'll post them on Campus Cruiser and make sure that they're in each of the weekly course contents. As for slides, I'll do the same thing as I did last semester and post those with as much advance as I can. The piece that I'm always updating every semester for this class is the examples that I run through for the analyses. So that I can use examples from our data set. So then I always have to sort of shift that into there. So that's really the only holdup ever in getting the slides to you. Course policies, they're all the same as in 850, so I'm not going to regurgitate them for you all. You're all grown-ups, and so I trust that you can read the syllabus and get all of that. But obviously let me know if you have questions about any of that. Any questions now about any of the course policies? All right. Same drill as last time in terms of the weekly meetings. We'll do them on Zoom. I'll record them and then post them and link to them. So same thing there. As we discussed at the end of the summer, I'll do office hours by appointment. So just email me if you need to meet, when you need to meet, and we'll figure out a time that works for both of us. As for the assignments for this class, a good chunk of the class is the individual statistical analysis assignments. And then we'll continue the brief report that we started last semester over the summer. And the first piece of that is your variable description worksheet, which I'll talk about a bit more at the end. The analysis plan, an in-class presentation of your findings, and then the draft and the final version of your full brief report, integrating the feedback that I gave you over the summer. And then we'll do a comprehensive exam practice exam for the research comprehensive exam. So that will give you a chance to do that and get some feedback on that and find out where you might want to focus some of your studying. And so for the weekly analysis assignments, what I'll basically do each week is pose a question that can be answered using our data set. And you'll use the analysis that we learned that week to answer the question and write up your results. You can work in groups of up to 3 people. And I highly recommend working in groups of people. I think particularly for statistics, it's really helpful to be able to talk out those ideas. And use that as a way to help you learn that. And then every week I'll get you feedback on that. And so as we go through the weeks, at the beginning I'll be fairly generous with grading and say, like, here's all the things that you need to attend to. Make sure you're doing this, make sure you're doing that. I took off just a half a point or a quarter point or something. But now you know, and so next time, I'll take off, I'll be sort of less lenient as the semester goes on after I've already corrected whatever errors there are. And a lot of that ends up being formatting stuff, APA formatting stuff, so just keep a close eye when I make those edits throughout. And as we go each week, I'll pose a question. You'll write up the answer to that question using the analysis that you do to get that answer. And then I want you to think a little bit about the implications of these findings. So now that we know the answer to this question, what would we ever do with that answer? Does it have implications for future research, for clinical practice, for education, for policy? And thinking again, and we'll talk a bit more about this, about what are the concepts? Who do we have in our sample? Are the scores highly skewed? Was there not much variability? What do these findings really mean? So as we do these assignments each week, just pay attention to that and think about that. And then typically when there are tables in the assignments, I'll give you a template for that table. But anytime when you're putting tables in text, whether it's your brief report or your dissertation down the line, They should be always easy to read and in APA format. And so I'll give you some templates for those. Any questions about the weekly analysis assignments?
I have one. Wait, are we in we're the same group for each week?
Yeah, I mean, you could change the group if you wanted to, or do 1 week on your own if you're going to be away or something like that. You don't have to stay in the same group. It just means that all of your group members for whatever week you did that together, you get the same score on that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Awesome. And as we go through the semester, what I'll do with the weekly analysis assignments, the first one, I'll kind of give you a sort of a full template of, you know, if I ask this question, this is what this write-up would look like. And then every week I'll give you less and less of a structure, assuming that you have that structure down and built as we go. All right, so general tips, and I said this already, but work together, really capitalize on that. I find that with stats in particular, there's often like, oh, I didn't understand this part, but you got that part, and I understood this part, and so like now together we've got it, and I'm able to help you understand, etc. So I think working together, particularly for stats, is really useful, and also practicing. So as the semester goes on, I'll post some practice problems and answers for each of the week's analyses so that you can go through them and just try and practice and say, like, did I figure out the steps? Did I get the same answer? What are the interpretations that I should be thinking about or the implications I should be thinking about? So I'll post those as we go along so that you can practice if you are so inclined. And asking questions, I think you guys are generally pretty good about this, but if you don't understand something, it's likely somebody else is having that same experience. So feel free to jump in anytime. And I'm gonna try and provide links to some online lectures. Ask your peers about tutors if you're really struggling. There are several people in previous classes who have used tutors, and I think there are a couple of folks in this semester who are using tutors. So if that's accessible and useful to you, that may be something to think about. And again, trying to work together with one another. So 851 in a nutshell, we're going to go over a lot of the foundational concepts in statistics. We'll start out a bit today with some of the descriptive statistics, which we've talked about a little bit, but I think it's helpful to come back to them now that you have a concrete data set that you're able to think about and work with. We'll talk a bit more about data cleaning and management techniques, and we'll talk about some of the theoretical and conceptual foundations of inferential statistical tests. So sort of what are they doing and why is that the way that it's done? And then we'll talk about some of these foundations and applications of basic statistical tests. And so kind of how to do them, when you do what kind of test. And then we'll complete the research cycle in thinking about how we interpret and report results and how we engage in these scholarly conversations. And really, I think of research and peer-reviewed articles and presentations and things like that as part of this scientific conversation we're having with one another. And we had this whole conversation. We had a 2 days of faculty retreat yesterday and today. So we had a whole conversation about like, how do we do this? How do we model these scholarly debates and engagements and conversations for students and sort of just for one another? So we'll really focus in on that and try and think a little bit about what that looks like in practice. Because it sounds lovely in theory, right? Any questions about any of that so far? All right. So I'll talk a little bit about my approach to data analysis, and I think this mirrors a lot of what I talked about in my approach to research methods more generally at the beginning of the summer, that these statistics are mathematical tools to gain some sort of conceptual results. And so, as I've said a bunch of times before to you all, really keep thinking conceptually, like what is this thing? What is body appreciation? What is jealousy? What are these things conceptually, and how does the measure match or not match? Do a good job at measuring that. And so really thinking about what these things mean and what the results mean. Thinking critically, thinking logically, and getting a sense of thinking like a researcher. And so I know a lot of folks have a lot of math anxiety around statistics classes. And I think I've said this to you all before, but I'm terrible at math, like embarrassingly terrible at math, and have had a lot of math anxiety my whole life. And statistics, because they are conceptual, make more sense to me and sort of fit with the way that I think. So I know it's hard to just say, like, put that anxiety aside. Don't think about that. If only it were that easy, right? So as much as you are able, try and think of it as not math necessarily, as more of a conceptual or logic kind of a puzzle, rather than math. So however much that helps you, consider that. And as we'll talk about a bit more, I think next week I have that in the readings. Statistical analyses and conventions are always evolving, and really not without some controversy. So I'll have you read a couple of articles, might be in a couple of weeks, about p-values, which is how we judge whether something is statistically significant. And there is still a lot of debate in the literature about what kind of marker we should be using and what that actually means. Because the way that a lot of folks talk about it, a lot of skilled, amazing scientists talk about it, is not quite accurate. And so these conventions and these ideas are still very much evolving, and we're getting better and better at modeling as we have better machine learning and computer modeling kinds of processes available to us. So these things are always evolving and changing. So I'll give you a fairly traditional approach to statistical analyses, and then also talk a little bit about where those controversies are coming in and what kinds of things may be changing as we move forward in the field. And then, as we'll talk about a little bit with the two news articles I gave you about the research study about alcoholism, we always want to interpret our results in the context of measurement and methods. So who we have in our sample, how we got them there, what kinds of measurements we're using, and how those might be similar to or different than other kinds of measurements. And interpreting our findings in conversation with existing literature. So we found this really interesting, amazing, unique thing, and no one else has found it. And so what's happening over here for us? Or we found this thing which is completely consistent with all the rest of the literature. And so that helps me understand what that finding means, or how valid I think that finding is in the world. So we're always not just thinking about the one thing in front of us, but really thinking about research as part of a larger conversation that we're having in the field. So, so a very practical, very pragmatic approach to data analysis, in much the same way that I have to research more broadly. Did folks get a chance to read the two news articles that I posted about the alcoholism study?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Awesome. What did folks think about that, about those two different perspectives?
This is Tanya. I had to jump in to say, I was reading the first one and I was like, did I write this? Because I don't want to like diss my writing, but I was like, oh my God, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Oh, so like your comment was that the writing was not good.
Well, that they weren't clear on what the findings were and explaining, like, even the gaps between the years. And I was just like, wait, what? This doesn't make sense. How do we know if they use the same questions? I had a lot of questions, and I kind of felt like you, Dr. Wells. I was like, so now I know I should ask all these questions, because if you don't put it in there, then people just don't know.
Right. Yeah. Other thoughts?
So I was surprised at first because I was reading the first article and like they had put a link to the IS or DSM criteria that they were using. And so I was like, oh, like that's good. It kind of shows that they're backing it up. But then like as I'm going in and reading more and more, it's like, well, you know, those might not actually be linked. Like like as I started going on, the first article started seeming more and more like questionable. Like, you know, is this really like what the statistics were saying, you know? And because there was such a big gap between like the years and all of that. So like once we got to the second article, I was like, yeah, like I kind of had a feeling like that's where it was going, but it was really surprising because at first I was like, oh, this is looking like it's nicely set up. And then as you go further in, it was like, no, it's not at all.
Right. Yeah.
I actually accidentally read the second one first, so I already knew what was coming.
Right.
I was kind of just like looking at it from like a bigger picture, like from a prevention standpoint, and thinking to myself like, wow, when this information goes public, how funders for like different prevention programs and like educational programs, how that really can sway their opinion in one direction or another as far as what we implement to society. And like, it just makes me curious, like how much digging do they do to verify what should actually be implemented and not be implemented? Because, you know, it's easy to say, well, this well-respected research institute is supposed to be giving us accurate information, but when you break it down and really look at the details of everything that they showed, is it really accurate or not, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Dr. Wells.
I was just going to say, I think that that is, I think you're right that probably most people don't dig, right? And like say, oh, that's interesting. I should look at the way they measured that, right?
Well, exactly. They probably don't think about it because until now, like I've never really thought to question headlines or things that you read. You just kind of like, if it seems like it's coming from a legitimate scholarly source, you're just like, well, that must be, you know, true.
Yeah.
I think I read the second one first too, because I had them out of order. But I wondered who was funding her research, just because. And then also I wondered, as a researcher, how could she not think that those the way the methods were changed between the two studies? Why wouldn't she think that it was there would be a difference? Like it was almost as if she didn't have any common sense.
I agree. I thought it was funny because after I read the article and I read the point one of, I forgot exactly right now exactly what it was. I said to myself, after you changed just this, I mean, that's going to make a huge difference. And then it was like 7 bullet points later of all these different ways that it was changed over time. And then later on it said, you know, they made a comment like that in the article about even with one of these, it would have made a difference. So it was just funny when the way it was written, that after the first bullet point or first number or whatever it was, I thought to myself, researchers after this point should see how this could make such a difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what did you think about her response to the questions, like how she interacted with the journalists?
Don't call me anymore.
Yeah.
I was tickled. I was like, wow, she's really defensive.
I know. I was like, ooh.
She said after 2 phone calls, and then once the article was published, then she finally was like, well, yeah, I guess you're right. Like, why can't you just be honest from the very beginning? And yes, she was shady and rude, Tanya.
Yeah. I was like, ooh, that's a bold move to be like, you know. It's yeah. I don't know that I would have that quite a bold of an approach to that. So yeah, and it's, you know, it's always hard as a researcher for me. Caveat that to talk to journalists and try and feel like I'm making it accessible to folks who don't have a research language, and also representing the research well and not oversimplifying it, which I think is often what happens when it's conveyed to the media, because it's necessary, right, to simplify it to make it palatable to people. So I try and respect how challenging those conversations are, and also, yeah, possibly rude and shady. So yeah. But I think the piece that I was really interested in that is the measurement piece of that, in terms of, what do those measures mean and what are they telling us? And particularly around alcohol measures, they talk a lot about sensitivity. So how sensitive is that measure to detecting alcohol abuse issues? And there's a lot of conversation about then, what is an alcohol abuse issue? So do we use the DSM criteria? Do we use other criteria from different kinds of scales? And yeah, I was having a whole conversation with my doctor last time I was there. They always ask you, like, how many drinks do you have every week, blah, blah, blah. And we were going through it and talking about the CDC recommendations. For women, I think it's 7 drinks a week. And for men, it's 16 or 15 maybe drinks a week, something like that. And we were chatting about, like, how many drinks, what, like, how they develop those criteria. I'm sure my doctor loves that I come in being like, but let's talk about how that's measured. I don't know. She's like, just tell me how many drinks you have, right? But so we had a whole conversation about, I was like, but you can't be concerned about my drinking, because on the audit alcohol use disorders identification test, that scores a lot of points. So we can't talk about this anymore, because my score is going to really go up if we have this conversation. She was like, well, that's not the measure I use. So we had a whole conversation about which is the best measure. So I think about these alcohol measures a lot, both in my work and apparently at the doctor's office. So I think it's interesting to think about sort of what these each mean as we think about them. Any other comments about that before we jump back in?
I was just going to say, just thinking about different measures, it's interesting how each measure is for maybe like a certain group of people.
Mm-hmm.
Like the doctors use the CDC measurement, and that's mainly because they're all about prevention. Whereas you're using something different to look at what people are really doing, like maybe a qualitative measure. So you're not looking at prevention in your studies.
Right. Like doctors might be concerned with it, just how many drinks are you having this week? And I'm more concerned about, like, have you tried to stop and weren't able to stop? Have you, do you feel like you need more than you used to need? Things like that, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I always think it's interesting too, and I think I've said this to you all before, that this is something I have discovered in coming to Widener and getting a little bit more exposure to social workers and, marriage and family therapists and various other folks from different disciplines, is how many concepts we have that are so similar in different disciplines, that I can be like, oh, this is what I call it in psychology. And people are like, oh, well, in sociology, we call it this other thing, and we have our own measure for it. And here's how we conceptualize it. And here's our perspective on that. So yeah, I think that's a really good point, that we all bring these different perspectives to the measurement, as well as different needs of what those measures are going to do. Yeah. All right, let's dive into some stats. So this is all review. None of this is new. I just think it's good to go over now that we have data in front of us to be able to actually talk about. So we talked a lot about this last time, about the different kinds of variables and how the descriptive information that we need from those different kinds of variables is different. And so categorical variables, I'll often talk about categorical versus continuous. So categorical typically include both nominal and ordinal kinds of variables. So it could be things like grades, individual items that are Likert scale response options. And then nominal are these unranked categories. So like race or gender, where the number doesn't necessarily mean anything. The ordering of those groups doesn't have any inherent sort of numerical information or value. And then continuous measures include interval and ratio measures. And so in interval, you typically don't have a true zero. So 0 on the anxiety scale doesn't necessarily mean I am completely absent of anxiety. Whereas in a ratio kind of a measurement, there is a true zero, and the scores have a bit more information about where they are in relation to one another. So height or age or something like that. We also talk a little bit about count variables, and we'll get into how we deal with these variables a bit differently towards the very end of the semester. Count variables are a bit different because they tend to be distributed differently. And we'll talk, I think, next week about some of the sort of basic characteristics of the data that we tend to collect and the ways in which those data tend to look typically. And we'll talk a little bit about that today as well. But these count variables typically they don't behave in the same way. So if you ask somebody, one of the variables that I've used a ton is number of anal sex acts. And so a lot of people have like 0, 1, or 2, or 3 of those in a month or in a 2-week period or something like that. And then so you'll have a very skewed look at that variable and a very limited amount of variability, even though the variability that's there is still really important. With count variables, and I talked about this a little bit when we talked about outliers, you could also have somebody in the sample who has 342 anal sex acts in the last month or something like that. So you can have, values between 0 and infinity. Though with that kind of a variable, not necessarily infinity, but you know what I mean. And so because those distributions tend to look different, we often treat them differently in many of our statistical analyses. And I would say that has been a slightly newer development in statistics as well, that we are getting better and better about thinking about the models that we use and the analyses that we use for that particular kind of variable. And so just as a quick review, we are talking about independent and dependent variables, which often in observational research we talk about as predictor or outcome variables. And so the outcome variable, the dependent variable, is typically what we're trying to predict or better understand. And these are all important to remember because they determine the kind of descriptive statistics you'll use, the kind of inferential statistical analyses that you'll use, and how you present data as well. And I'll link to a website. I am blanking on her name right now, but it's a professor at University of Chicago who has put together, Jill something. She's put together a bunch of PowerPoint slides and lectures that she does online that talk about some of the basic things about how do you present data, how do you create a table, how do you decide what goes in a table, what goes in text, things like that. So I'll link to that site for you all. Any questions about any of that? All right. And so as we're talking about the kinds of descriptive information that we need to understand each of these variables, we're often talking about measures of central tendency. And what we mean by that is measures of what this variable tends to look like, right? Like on average, what does this variable look like? And so for continuous data, we can calculate a mean, which is the same as the average. And again, that can be really sensitive to these extreme scores. So if we have somebody who had 342 anal sex acts and everybody else has like 0 to 5, that 342 is going to have a really big influence on what that mean number looks like and on what the standard deviation is as well. Median is the middle value. And that can be really useful when we're thinking about skewed variables to give us a sense of where the middle of that distribution of all of the scores is. And then the mode is the one that occurs most frequently. So we often think about the mode in both skewed data sets with continuous variables and also with categorical variables. So that can help us to really understand. And what we're trying to do with all of these, in some cases we may use all of them to really try and understand what's going on, as well as sort of just basic frequency counts and percentages to really get a sense of what this variable looks like, what this construct looks like. Are people high in that? Are they low in that? Is there a huge amount of variability? Is it a very small amount of variability and everybody clusters around a certain point? What do most people say? So really trying to get a sense of what our sample looks like and what that variable looks like, kind of how it's behaving just on its own before we do anything with it. Any questions about any of that? All right, so variability is kind of the name of the game as we go into statistics. And I'll show you a couple of pictures from our own data set to talk a little bit more about this, but variance is this average squared distance of all the points from the mean. And I'll show you a picture of this in just a second. And what this helps us understand is how well that mean actually describes the people in the sample. And so the variance, the number that we get for variance is a squared number. So we typically do the square root of that, which is the standard deviation. So that's basically the average distance from the mean. And I think I drew a picture of that in one of our days in our weekend class. And this gives us a sense of how well that mean is doing at actually describing the people in our sample. So as I said, variability is good. Often if we're trying to predict a variable using another variable, we have to have something to predict. So if everybody has the same score, that can't necessarily be a variable because there's no variability that we're looking at. There's no distinction between people that we're trying to understand or association between variables that we're trying to understand. So if we're looking at categorical variables, typically if we're thinking that more than 90% of the sample is in one of our categories, that's a problem. And we may just not be able to use that variable at all if we actually don't have any variability on it. For continuous variables, there aren't necessarily these hard and fast rules about how much variability you need to have. But if everybody has the same score or very close to it, that's a problematic issue potentially for you. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to adjust for that and account for that as we move forward. So let's talk about reliability a bit more. And we talked about some of these basic ways of thinking about reliability. Typically, we're talking about internal consistency when we're talking about psychometric reliability. So the consistency with which a scale or a subscale measures the same thing, a single thing. And so there are all these ways that people can assess reliability. The way that most people probably use is alpha. So you'll get this Cronbach's alpha, and that is mathematically equivalent to the average of all of the possible split halves. That sounds like a lot of words in there. And I talked about this a little bit in our class. The split half reliability is where we would take all of the items, divide them into two sets, and calculate the correlation between the two halves. And the Cronbach's alpha does that over and over. So every possible way that you could have the items, it does that and calculates the correlation. And so then this alpha that we get is basically this average of all of those correlations. So ideally something is in the 8.8 to 0.9 range, 0.6 to 0.7 is generally totally fine as well. And this is often a process that folks will go through when they're developing a scale to try and understand if there are items that they can drop and try and make that scale a bit shorter, and if it's actually sort of working in the way that they think that it should be working. Any questions about any of that before we jump into our data? No? All right. All right. So people may have noticed that I closed the survey. I did a check for everybody to make sure folks would have enough data. So the survey is now closed, and I've created a final sample and uploaded a data set for you all, which was linked in today's class. So between July 20th and August 28th, we had 2,359 people who clicked on the link for our survey. And what I've shown here then is sort of how we whittled down to the number that we have in the final sort of big sample that we'll be using to pull from. So 40 of those people didn't provide consent. 71 people, in addition to those, stopped answering questions after the consent. So they maybe clicked yes on the consent and then closed the whole thing. There was one person who didn't indicate age, and so the survey actually stopped them, so they're gone. And there were 46 people who didn't answer anything to gender. They didn't see the questions. And that was the very next demographic question. So they didn't go on in the survey. So we eliminated them. And so we're ending up with 2201 in the final sample. And for many of you, and for many of the analyses we'll run, we'll have a much smaller sample. So there are some people who did half of it and stopped doing it. There are some people who skipped some answer or skipped some questions, so we won't be able to have scale scores for them on some of the scales. So I may say let's compare people according to racial or ethnic group on, I'm trying to remember one of our variables, on jealousy. And so maybe we have a chunk of people who didn't answer any of the race or ethnicity questions, and so we actually don't include them in that sort of analysis that we do. So then the sample size may actually be smaller. And for those of you who are looking at sort of subsets of different people, so only African American women or only men or, you know, whatever kind of subsample, you'll have smaller groups of people in those as well. So the next thing that you'll want to do is create your final sample for your research question. And every week when I do the weekly analysis assignments, I'll create a sub data set, like another data set for you all, and upload that one with the assignment so that you'll all be working from the same data set. It'll be a much smaller data set. You won't have to sort of do anything with that one to get it in working order. So the next thing that you'll want to do is think about, all right, who gets deleted from my data set, who stays in. For many of you, you can probably delete the variables that you don't need and start getting yourself down to a clean data set. For those of you who had syntax that was ready to go on the last day of class, then you'll be ready to run that. And then for those of you who are still working on that, let me know if you want to touch base, if you need help pulling that together. In terms of our sample, this is a little bit of a sense of what folks look like. So our mean age is about 36, and the standard deviation is 10.85. So that means that on average, the distance between each person and the mean of 36.44 is 10.85. So we have quite a range there, and we see that in the range here, our participants ranged from age 18 to 77. And our median age is 35, so that's right in the middle of the whole distribution. And our modal age, which is the most common age reported, was 28. So right around in sort of the high 20s, mid 30s range. When we look at gender, we have 85.5% who indicated that they are woman only. So they checked woman and cisgender or just woman in the options. 11.3 who said that they were man only. So same thing, man and cis or just man. And then 3.2% of the sample fell into one of the other categories. So that could be transgender, gender nonconforming, gender non-binary. We kind of lumped all of those folks into a single group, and we can talk more going forward if there are subgroups of that you think are interesting or ways in which we want to lump people differently. There are a good chunk of people, not like a huge chunk, but I don't remember the number off the top of my head. There are some people who only put in cisgender for their gender identity and nothing else. So we don't really know what they are, cisgender of some sort. So those folks will end up being missing for us. When we look at sexual identity, this is a tough one to crunch and to sort of categorize into smaller groups. I don't think anybody is looking at differences according to sexual identity. So you may decide that for your description of your sample, you want to leave it just as it is, like this. You want to just say that this doesn't add up to 100 because people could choose multiple identity labels for themselves. Or you could say, I'm going to lump people into straight and otherwise, or gay and mostly gay and otherwise, sort of whatever it is that you think is an important marker or an important way of looking at your sample. I went ahead and recoded the 10 people who wrote in other or some other label best describes me, and then wrote in straight or heterosexual. So I already did the syntax to put them into the heterosexual category. So that's already done in the data set that you all have. And I'm happy to upload the syntax if folks want to download a raw data set and go through that syntax process themselves. We had 22 people who indicated that their sexual identity wasn't listed and put in all sorts of other things that we can talk about, whether we want them to go in existing categories that we already have, or if you want to leave them in that sort of not listed category. And I'll show you some of those options in just a second. So we also might want to think about, if we are interested in crunching this variable at all, how we might want to handle people with multiple identities. So from my recollection, and I'll pull it up in just a second, I don't think there were a ton of people who chose all of the options. Last year we had somebody who chose every single option, and I think we ended up dropping them from the sample because that felt like it probably wasn't accurate. But yeah, I don't think we had anybody who did that this year. This is straight from the output for SPSS, from SPSS. This is the relationship status. And this one does need some cleanup. So when we look up here, and I think I talked about this a little bit when I presented some of the frequency stuff in our class, but you get 4 different columns here when you run a basic frequency table. One is frequency, which is just the number of people who gave each of those responses. The percent is often different from the valid percent. If you look down here under percent, you have a percentage for the people who are missing. Over here, you don't count them into the missing. So the valid percent tells you, of the people with valid answers, what percent indicated that they were single, what percent indicated they were in a monogamous relationship, multiple consensual non-monogamous relationships, casually dating, or my relationship status is not listed. This is how I would define my current relationship status. We have 160 people in that group, so that is one that we probably need to clean up. And I'll remind me when we go back over to the data, I'll show you what those responses are. It's a lot of married. And so I think we talked about this in class, that that was our next question. So we didn't have married in some of those options because we broke those up into 2 questions. But people kind of got stuck in this and felt like married was the best response option for them. So we'll talk about some ways we could address that. Any questions? I'm just running through. I think you're all still there. Yeah, you're still there. That's good. Okay. Any questions, comments so far?
None from me.
All right. All right, so then when we look at race and ethnicity, this is pretty similar to what we looked at when we talked about the preliminary data in class. About half the sample identify as Black, African American, Caribbean, or African. A good chunk of the rest of the folks identify as white. And then we have some people who are multiracial or ethnic, Latino, Latina, Latinx, Asian or Pacific Islander, and then we have some folks who are who chose another category, chose sort of an other option and wrote something in, or who are missing. And we'll pop over to SPSS in just a second and look at those folks and try and make some decisions about that. And so when we look at jealousy, we also looked at some of these basic descriptives, and they didn't change a ton when we got the rest of the data in. The mean cognitive score is about 10.3. The mean emotional score is 32.61, and I have down below sort of how it could range. to give you a sense of where that score actually falls in there. So we see that people had sort of decently high emotional scores in terms of how they would react if their partner was cheating. And then the behavioral score is a sort of a bit on the lower end, mid to lower end, considering the full range. And same thing for the cognitive score. It tends to be on the lower end when you consider that full range. And then I also ran the Cronbach's Alpha for each of the subscales. And I think I did this in our weekend class as well, but each of these are totally respectable Cronbach's Alphas. So we feel pretty good about each of the items on those subscales actually measuring the same thing. So what do you think after looking at that, at all of those descriptives? Sort of what does the sample look like to you? Do you feel happy about who we got? Thoughts?
I was actually surprised by how many people identified as bisexual.
Mm-hmm. How many identified as bisexual? That was
about 9% was 215.
So yeah, if we look, 215 people.
And then being 230 being straight, identifying as straight. So yeah, I thought that was, well, I guess, mostly straight.
Mostly straight, yeah. Yeah, so if we combine the straight and mostly straight people, we might get an even higher number over here.
Right.
Yeah. Do we think that's a function of who we are, of what year it is, of what do you think that's a result of?
I would say a combination of those things. I think people are more comfortable at this point in time than ever before, coming out, but also I think we are in touch with other populations. I know I posted to the Facebook group that I was a part of for the MED program. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure a lot of diverse populations had access to it.
Right. Any other thoughts? How do folks feel about the age and the gender distributions?
I'm not surprised that mostly women completed the survey over men. That's not surprising.
Why is that not surprising to you? What is that?
I just don't think men take the time to complete surveys the way women do.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely some of it, and that's I can say from some experience that so many of the research studies I've been a part of, when there has been a sort of a mixed gender group, men are often the ones that we are waiting on at the end of the study, trying to sort of get the last of the men in there. So, yeah. Anything else? Y'all got a ton of people, so that's amazing. So these are all things that we want to think about as we present our findings. So here's what we found. Also, this is mostly women, or whatever is relevant for how you interpret your particular results. So I'll probably grab a couple of you to work on relationship status. I think this particular question I think is most relevant for Nicoletta's question, so I may have her help me work on some of that. And then there's a follow-up question to this one about married and cohabiting, and that's Noni's question. So I'll have Noni do some cleanup on that one as well. And as we clean up, I'll upload sort of updated data sets for you, and I'll also upload the syntax in case you just want to run that on the data set that you have. So when we look at the scores on the jealousy scale, this is what we call a histogram, which I think all the reading in your book, you probably got a pretty decent overview on that. And so I've created histograms in SPSS that show the normal curve. And I'm not going to get into much of that this lecture, but we'll talk about that next week in terms of thinking. The normal curve basically says, this is how we think the data typically should look, that you have a bunch of people in the middle and fewer people out on the either side of sort of the extremes of the scale. And so when you ask SPSS to create a histogram, it'll put the normal curve on there for you, and then you can look at the data and say, does that match? And in this particular case, we see that it doesn't. It's this shape of what the data looks like. And what we're seeing here is down here on the x-axis, there are the cognitive subscale scores. So ranging over here from 0 up to 40, but really from about 5 to 40. And then the frequency over here is the number of people who had each of those scores. So we see that there's a ton of people over here who had this very lowest score, who never are suspicious that their partner is cheating at all. So we have a ton of people in this very low end of this. So if it weren't for that, this would look a little bit more normal. But what we see here is that we have a skewed variable here. So we have many more responses over here at the end, rather than kind of in the middle where you think that most people will end up being. So this variable is a little bit skewed. So we'll talk about that a bit more next week in terms of how we might deal with that variable or think about what that means. The emotion subscale score, however, does look a bit more normally distributed. So we have the same thing, these emotion subscale scores down here on the x-axis and the number of people who got each of those scores on the y-axis. And what we see over here, this mean is 32.61, and so probably somewhere right here. And so the mean is typically at the sort of top of this curve right here. And so the mean is up here at the top of the curve, and we do in fact see most of the people somewhere here in the middle, and then far fewer people on either end, which is what we tend to think is a pretty normal distribution. If we go back to the cognitive scores, we see that this mean is 10.35. And so this mean is again over here in the middle, but we have such high numbers over on the end. So it doesn't sort of flatten out on either end as we assume that it does in a normal distribution. Yeah, I had hoped more men would fill out the survey as well. But yeah, Keisha, you have plenty. I checked and made sure you'll be good for your assignment. And then we go over to the behavior subscale score. And what we see with the behavior subscale score is it's also a bit skewed over here, with a lot of folks being more at the lower end of the scale. The mean score is a 14, so probably right over here where the top is here. But what we see is the data don't look as normally distributed as they do if we go back to the previous one on the emotion subscale score. So we'll talk a bit more next week about what normal distributions are, why they're important, what they mean. But this just gives you a little bit of a sense of the variability. So when I mentioned before that we're looking at variability and we always want some variability, what we're always looking at in statistical analyses is trying to figure out the why of variability. So why did so many people score this lowest point over here? Why is this person over here? Why is that person over there? Is there anything that we can use that we know about this person to be able to predict or better understand why people score the way that they do, why somebody's score is high or somebody's score is low? That's sort of the essence of what we're always trying to do, is understand this variability. So I'm sure folks have probably looked at the qualitative responses a bit more because they're fascinating and you don't have to run statistical analyses to look at them. So I'm sure folks have looked at those a bit more. Does that, do any of those responses change the way that you are interpreting their quantitative data or their scale scores or the way that they answered questions or anything like that? No? Nothing? All good? Okay. I also, and I'm pulling this data set up right now, but I also, per our conversation in class, I did it kind of late, but I added a question to the survey that said, we're interested in better understanding jealousy. You completed all these questionnaires, but now tell us a little bit more about what what jealousy means to you. And we only got 6 responses for that, but we put that up at the very end, so that's not terribly surprising that we didn't get a ton of responses, and it wasn't sort of a main component of our questions, so I'm fine with that. But this gives you, can folks see the SPSS file now? Yes? Sure?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. So we only have a few responses up here, and they're not terribly different, I don't feel like, from what we were seeing in the other responses. But this, this can definitely help us to understand sort of, where people may have struggled at answering the questions, what they might be thinking of as sort of exceptions to how they answered or clarifications to how they answered, things like that. So it's way too long, got it. There's a lot of stuff in there, I think partly in response to the condom question at the end. That was Rachel's question. So there's a lot of stuff in there about like, I said never, but I'm on birth control, I'm infertile, I'm, whatever. And as we noted in class, there were a lot of people who were like, yes, I look at my partner's Facebook page all the time, but that's not jealousy. So I think that's an interesting sort of piece of that. I don't know that it necessarily changes the way that you interpret or think about the data, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about as we're asking those questions. And I think some of the qualitative data can just help us think about, all right, that questionnaire didn't work for somebody, or wow, I had this whole other question, but the way that people talked about this in the qualitative answer gives me a totally different way of looking at that. And so maybe my whole question, the way I've been thinking about this, changes moving forward. So I think it's often good to think about what people are saying and make sure that nothing changes your interpretation of the scale or your findings or whatever. So any questions about any of that piece before we jump over to the data? All right, so I'm going to share screen again and come back to the SPSS data. And so I'm going to go over, can folks see that big enough? I feel like sometimes on the screen share with SPSS, it can be a little challenging to see. All right, so I'm going to show you all some of the race and ethnicity variables, and we can talk a little bit about where we think folks might want to go in there. So there are some people who, a good chunk of people who put in things that were like mixed, multiracial, multi-ethnic. These are the other variables that I made using their responses. So we have race in 6 categories, and then a dichotomized variable that's people of color and white people. And so some folks gave us enough information in the check all that apply to be able to categorize them in some way over here. And some people put in something else. So things like human. We have 2 people who are human in here, and they didn't put anything else in. So they're just missing because we don't know. We have these folks in here who are these presumably South African folks. What do people think about how we categorize those folks?
Well, I guess I should speak to this. Colored can mean many things. in South Africa. It can mean literally one of my parents is black and one of my parents is white, but it also means anything else. So because we don't know like who those people, I mean, one of my friends who describes herself as colored, her dad is Filipino. So I think that there's so many variations within the colored community in South Africa. I think it should be left like as it is, just because in South Africa, being colored is a culture and a community within itself. And while we don't really like identify with that here in the United States, it is very specific there. So I feel like we should really like leave it alone as it is, and not put it anywhere else.
Awesome. I think that's great. When I was thinking about it the other day, I was like, oh, well, that must go in with like Black and African. And I was like, actually, I don't know anything about that. So I'm not going to make that judgment call until I have a little bit more information. So that was way different than I think I thought that should be. So thanks for that. As we think about where other people can fit, there are a few other folks in here who either didn't check anything or checked some unique combination of things that I'll have to recode and play with. So I'll fix up some of those. We do have a chunk of people in here who didn't say anything and put something in like European descent. So I can take some of those European descent folks. Do folks have thoughts about where they should go?
It's just European descent.
Yeah, that's for some of them. That's all they checked was just this number 13, which is European descent. So some of those get put into white because of other things that they checked. So they put in white under number 12. So they checked that one. So a lot of those folks are put over here into white. But it looks like we have a couple who checked European descent and American only. How do folks feel about putting them into the white category, or would you rather leave them as missing?
I mean, I feel like given how we describe race here, I feel comfortable putting them in white, but that's just me.
I'm okay with that too, because they're marking American, European American. I think white would be okay. Maybe they're trying to say they're Caucasian.
Yeah, and there are definitely some people who put in that and put in, combinations of other things. I think there are some people in here who only checked American. So those folks, I think, should probably stay missing because American that doesn't really tell us anything, right? I kind of want to assume white, but I know that's not coming from a great place. And so yeah, my sense would be to leave those folks as missing. And then you have some people who actually just said, I don't want to answer this. So they are actually missing. So I'll clean those folks up a little bit more. Did folks get to... Oh, did I post this for you all? Did I post the code switch episode that talks about the Latino designation on the census?
I don't think so. I don't remember seeing it though.
Okay, I'll post it. I might have put it in the other announcement that I put in there with some podcasts in there. I hate to I'm really not trying to shove podcasts down your throats. But I think some of the science podcasts are potentially really helpful to think about how researchers think, the kinds of questions that folks are asking when they're trying to digest research. things like that. So there are some good ones. I linked to Hidden Brain and a couple of others that I really like. I was listening to one from Code Switch the other day, and I was talking to Dr. Citron about this, and he was like, oh yeah, I have a whole book on this. It's a whole thing. So you might have come into contact with some of this reading material before. But the whole podcast episode was about when the census started counting or measuring Latino in the way that it does. And we see this in a lot of national level data. So anything you do that's funded by the NIH, they want you to ask race and ethnicity in this very specific way, where the first question is, are you Hispanic or Latino? And then you click yes or no. And then completely unrelated to that is, what is your race? And there are some Latino folks who are like, I just said that I was Latino. Why are you asking me this other question now? And then other people who are like, yes, I wanted to mark that I was white or black or, whatever. And there's a lot of debate about, how we categorize people, and, that gets increasingly complicated as we move forward in time. And I thought it was really interesting that they talked about some of the background, so like kind of the political background of why Latino was named in the way that it was, and sort of the political stuff around that of like, all right, now Latino became a census designation. So now you have Latino rights groups and, some of these things that that while they existed before, they had this name and this grouping in a way that that wasn't there before until it was put in place by the census. So I think it's just super interesting to think about like how we make these categories and how we name them, and then how they are used in the world, and how they shape policy and communities. And they really talked about how community leaders were coming in and saying like, no, this is the box we want you to check because we have to be counted. We have to know how many are here so that we can get services, so that we can demonstrate need and all of this stuff. So I thought it was really interesting, especially as we think about sort of how we're putting people into groups and what those groups mean for people. So I'll post it if you have a chance to listen to it. I think it's super interesting. I may have actually put it in the syllabus. It's possible, but I'll check on that. All right, so now we have this sexual orientation or identity variable, and we have lots of different options. We have prefer not to answer, and we have this text response here, and we have a whole bunch of folks who fall into various other categories or not categories. So I took all these straight folks and took them out of this this not listed category, so they're already taken care of. But then, and I put the heterosexual person in there. I left the heteroflexible people in this other category. How do folks feel about those people going into mostly heterosexual? Or do people feel like they should go into bisexual, or we should just leave them alone? Or what do folks think?
I think also in general, but I mean, it's just hard because one of those heteroflexible, the other one,
I can't.
Something different.
You have a lot in there.
I was just saying, I feel weird because it's hard to define, and you know, them are saying basically. So I think it's hard to place them in one category.
Yeah. So it's challenging to put them into a category, not necessarily knowing what they mean by that. I think that's what you're trying to say.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So we can just leave them. As I said, I don't think anybody is using this variable as like, I'm comparing this group to this group. So we can also just say X number of people chose another category and put in all sorts of different answers, such as sex is touch, or 1 or 2 on the Kinsey scale, sexuality is complicated. I like men. I just like men. And so we could certainly take these 2 folks. So these are in these 2 rows, and we could say, All right, so this person said, I am a woman, and that was the only option that they checked on gender. And then they said, I just like men. So do folks think that we should put them into hetero?
Did that person respond? The person who gave those two responses, are they men, or how did they identify as far as their gender?
Yeah, they identified as woman only. So both of them said that they were women only.
I guess it's safe to assume that they're heterosexual.
What do other folks think?
I agree. I feel like
I agree.
Yeah. I feel like either they just didn't read everything, or maybe they just weren't clear on definitions of things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
Some people don't know what heterosexual is.
Yeah, and you can tell people like put that in there. Maybe they didn't see it, or these people might have looked at heterosexual and realize and like not known what that meant. So I'll take those like men folks and put them into that group. We have a good chunk of people who said demisexual. What do folks think about that group? Should we leave them on their own? Should we lump them in with another group?
I was thinking maybe, I forget what the different categories are. If there were, because there was like an asexual category.
Mm-hmm.
That's like typically an umbrella term that a demisexual person might identify under.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, if anything, that would probably be where it would go.
Right. Yeah. So I could.
My opinion.
Yeah, so we could put that in there and just say that like that category is asexual, which includes folks who identified as demisexual. So that's an option. And again, for your purposes, in terms of creating a sample table for your brief report, and as we move forward, you may say, I'm not going to lump anybody unless their answer makes sense, like unless they said straight and we can obviously put them into a category. I'm just going to leave them all as they are and give the percentages for every single response. So that might be what you say to preserve all of that diversity in how people describe themselves. Often when we're looking at things, we're trying to sort of clean them up, and particularly, so this relationship status variable that I said was a little messy. So my relationship status isn't listed. Situationship, I don't even know what to say. So serious relationships, separated, widower. And so I totally understand why people would not have checked. The options were single, monogamous, non-monogamous, casually dating. So I can see how single is not the same as widowed, right? That's a very different way of thinking about things. And recently separated, polyamorous, open relationship, non-monogamy in theory and not in practice, which is probably why they didn't check that they were currently in multiple consensual non-monogamous relationships. It's only in theory. There's a lot of married in there, which is unfortunate for Noni, because one of the things that she is interested in, although we can probably do some recoding, but if they said that they were in a serious relationship to this question, then they were going to get a follow-up question that asked them if they're married, cohabiting, neither, or something else. So we can probably move some of those folks around to make sure that they get captured into this category of married. But that's a little bit of syntax work that Noni will have to do to get all those folks into that category. Luckily, they all wrote it in mostly the same way, so it should be just a couple of lines of syntax to get all those people into that married category. But we have a whole bunch of other folks in here that we may want to think about recoding. The married ones are hard to recode in this category because it doesn't tell us whether they are monogamous or not, so it doesn't really answer the question. But it's clearly the way that a lot of people identified. So we have engaged folks in there. We can probably put them into the married category for the purposes of the paper that, the question that Noni is writing. We also, what else? We have casually dating, all sorts of things. So we'll probably want to clean this up a little bit. And then the same thing for this other relationship category, or there's not as many of these. So long distance dating, cohabiting, but also engaged. So probably they're married. 2 apartments. So that's something separate. So they are, I don't know if that means they're married and just not cohabiting, or what that means. So as we go through, and particularly as there are variables that you know that you are using, there are going to be ways that you're going to want to clean them up and make them sort of more presentable in terms of how you can describe the sample in that way. Anything else that I wanted to say about the scales themselves or the data at this point? Any questions about any of the data, about what we have so far, about syntax? Do folks feel like it would be helpful to do any sort of an SPSS review at this point, or do you want to wait until we actually start getting into some of the data cleaning next week?
I think next week or whenever we start doing it, it'd be really helpful to have a review. I mean, I'll be honest, I'm already like foggy on what we did on our weekend. And I know for me, when I start getting frustrated with like, because it's very like, you know, you have to put everything just precisely. If you make one mistake, then everything is crazy. So for me, having like a step-by-step checklist and like doing it and reviewing will really be helpful.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'm going to be like, overwhelmed.
Yeah, that makes sense. The sort of next steps in terms of what we're doing next, the next thing due is the 12th, and I'm just pulling up my calendar to orient myself to when is the 12th happening. So we'll have class next week, and then you'll have that assignment due the following week. So the next step will be to create your final data set and submit the variable description worksheet and table 1. And so I'll show you in just a second what that looks like. I will remind you again and again and again and again to breathe. We'll try and, you know, pop this into manageable chunks. And so hopefully that will be helpful for folks. Yeah, it sounds like other folks are potentially wanting some review next week as well. I'll show you a little bit. I'm going to try and find this document down here. I'll show you the tables that I'm going to ask you to put together. And I know that I uploaded the variable description worksheet, and I think that I put the sample table in there as well. But I'll give you a sense of what both of those look like. The variable worksheet, I'm going to share screen with you all now. So the variable worksheet here is, it has your variable name in there. I want you to put your research question up here at the top, just as a reminder. And then you'll put in your variable name, your label, what type of variable it is. Give me a sense of what that variable is. So I put the sexual assertiveness one. This is from last year's example. But this is a scale that's 17 items. It measures sexual assertiveness. I had to do some reverse coding of items, and then I calculated the mean in this following way. I'm thinking about using this question as a dependent variable, blah, blah, blah. And then here's some basic descriptive information and whatever cleaning that you did. So, I reverse coded these items. I created a total scale score, and I eliminated people who didn't have data on that variable. So that's how I got to where I got. So I want you to include that information for each of the variables that you're using in your research question. And then for the sample table, let me pull back over here. So for the sample table, I've given you kind of a descriptive sample characteristics table. And I just gave a sense of like a couple of the ways in which you could put data in here. So you can put gender identity in there. You want to give the number of people, so that's that frequency if we're going back to the table that I showed from SPSS. And then you can give the percentage of the sample that is. So if we're looking at income, what category did they fall into? If we're looking at sexual orientation, that's again categorical. And then for continuous variables that are best described by the mean and the standard deviation, I usually just put those in sort of a separate section like below the table so that I can put these headers there. So we might want to put age in there. If we measured depression, we could put that in there. Whatever that you measured continuously. Go ahead and put your variables of interest in that sample table. So for example, if you're also interested in sexual esteem as one of your variables and relationship status, then you could say, up here I'm going to put relationship status here, and then you could put that in here.
That's why I started working out here.
Is somebody talking and not on mute? Do you have a question?
No, sorry, that was me. I didn't know I wasn't muted.
That's okay. So if you were putting this in here, you could say married cohabiting and then put in those individual groups over here. So how many people is in each of those groups, what percentage of the sample, and then we could say sexual esteem down here, and this is what I'm putting in here. So you'll put that information both in the variable description table and in your sample characteristics table. So for your first assignment due on the 12th, you'll submit this sample, the sample characteristics table, and your variable description worksheet. So that's sort of the first thing to do is just to sort of get you into the data, get you creating your data set. Again, you can't break it. So if you download that data set and accidentally delete every single thing in it, that's okay. You just start again and download the data set and, play with it. So start thinking about who you want in your sample and get rid of the folks who you don't want in your sample. And you may have to do some variable cleaning to be able to have a variable on which you can exclude people or include people. You'll want to look at who has complete enough data for you to be able to keep them in your sample. So maybe they meet your criteria in terms of gender and race, but they actually had missing data on this other variable. So all those folks with missing data, you're going to get rid of those people. And when you do your sample characteristics table, that table 1, you want to do the sample characteristics for just your sample. So I don't want the sample characteristics for the full sample unless you're using the full sample and you have complete data. If you are not, just give me the sample characteristics for the people who are in your sample. Those are the people that you're going to want to describe and know about so that you have a little bit of context for your answer.
And those answers we get from like running through the syntax?
So the answers that you get, like to your ultimate research question, you'll get through the analyses that we run. And so basically what you want is to be able to describe your sample, both to describe them and get a sense of who's in your sample, but also so that when you get your answer to your question, ultimately, you can say like, all right, now I know the answer among mostly women or among, whatever, just to kind of help you contextualize that answer. Does that answer your question?
Kinda, I think.
Can you want to say it to me again and I can try and better answer it maybe?
I mean, I just in terms of getting the population for the people who answered our specific survey questions, I was kind of asking, how do we get that? Like, how do we know?
Right. Yes, I see what you're asking now. So I totally didn't answer that. Not even in the slightest. All right.
I thought I was crazy, but like then I wasn't sure.
Yeah, no, I didn't answer that. Okay, so let me pull over to the data, and I can show you a couple of different ways of doing that. So one of the ways of doing that is you could just say, I'm going to delete them manually. So for example, this is Rachel's condom question here, which is the one that was just most in front of me. So I can say that like, all right, I sorted that ascending, and now I'm going to go down and look at all the people who didn't answer that question. And so there are a bunch of people, because we only asked it of people who were in certain kinds of relationships. And so we can go down here and say like, all right, I'm going to take everybody who didn't have an answer to that, and I'm just going to come here and clear them out and delete them. That's the sort of manual non-syntax way to do that. Another way to do that would be doing it via syntax. And so I'm not sure if you'll be able to see. I'm going to stop my share and try and share my whole screen with you, which is going to look a little messy, but bear with me. So if I come over here and then go into SPSS and create a new syntax file, we have that syntax that we've used. Oh, and actually I think I have your syntax open for this one. I do. So we have all the syntax in here, and so I've already selected people like this syntax. Can everybody see the syntax and everything on the screen now?
Yes.
Yep, awesome. So this select if, I said only include people in the sample if their response to the consent question was a 2, which indicates that they gave consent. So you can go over here and say, all right, so that condom question, if I go over here to the end where that condom question was, it's con 1. So I can just do that select if kind of syntax. Oops, that's not what I want to do. I can do this select if syntax and copy and paste it down here. And I can say I only want to select people who have a score that is, and I think people could get a 0 on there. So let's put them for people who have a score of greater than -1, which will allow for people who have a 0 or a 1 to stay in the sample. So then we could run that, and that would eliminate all the people who had missing data on that particular question. If you were gonna delete people, for example, maybe you're only interested in people who are over 30. So you want to say like all these people who are below or who are in this 18 to 29 range, I want them out of my sample. I'm only interested in people over 30 for whatever reason. So you could do that same kind of syntax where you could say select if, and you could say age is greater than 29. And that will get rid of everybody in the sample who is 29 or under. So that's the way that you could do that. You could also just say, all right, on this age variable, I'm just going to scroll down until I get to those 30-year-olds. And there's my demarcation line right there. And so I'm just going to highlight everybody above that and clear them out. So that's sort of the non-syntax way that you could do that. You could also go up here and do data, select cases. And this is basically what gets you that syntax that I just wrote. So you could say select cases if, and you want to include the people. So if age is greater than, or you could use the greater than equal sign if you want to say, if age is equal to or greater than 30, and then we could continue. And you can either filter out unselected cases or delete unselected cases or copy those selected cases to a new data set, and you can give that data set a name. So we could say like over 30 folks. And then, I have to do the naming of the variables. So it just doesn't want spaces in there. So we could just say over 30. And then we can paste that. And if we go back over to the syntax, now we go, should be here. Maybe it went to the other syntax file. It did. So now we see I want to copy this data set into a data set called over 30, and then select if age is greater than or equal to 30. So those are sort of all the different ways that you could get to that same outcome. Does that answer your question? I think I did better that time.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. And then for those of you who are trying to get scale scores, you'll go through those same steps that we went through to identify what's a missing variable. So we have over here these -99s, and so we can just make sure that we are telling SPSS. So over here in these Facebook items, we want to be able to tell SPSS that -99 is missing. So this is how we do that manually and just go in and say that's what that missing is. You can also just copy and paste that, so non-syntax sort of a way. Or you can go into, I think it's data define variable properties, and then you put, so whatever this variable is, this is one of these Facebook variables, so we could just put that over there, scan that variable in, and then there's a -99 there, and we can just say, tell that -99 is missing. And then we can paste that in there, and that's the same thing that we would have written in syntax to say missing values on the FBJ9 variable are -99. So again, multiple ways that you can get to that same place, and then you want to create those scale total scores or average scores or whatever you want to create. And you'll do that through transform, and you can either recode, or if you're creating scale scores, you can do compute. And you'll basically go in there and say, I'm going to create this new variable that's Facebook jealousy total. You can tell SPSS what kind of a variable it is. Is it numeric or is it string, which is just text? You can give it a label. And then you basically go through the process of telling SPSS how you get that. So is that 1 plus 2? The other thing that you would want to do before that is make sure that you've reverse coded any items that you want to reverse code. And typically when I'm reverse coding items, I do the recode into a different variable so that I can let it know. I'm just going to put gender in there as a example, but that's not what I'm going to recode. So I want to say like, oh, so if I'm reverse coding this, then 5 equals 1, 1 equals 5, etc. And then you can go through that whole paste process, or you can just hit OK and make sure everything is reverse coded in the way that you want it to be. And I would just play around, try and see what you get, try and see if you can get it to work. And then if you get stuck, email me the syntax that you have, and I can probably help you, troubleshoot fairly quickly and say like, oh, you left the period off here, or you have the variable name wrong here. I feel like so often when I hit a roadblock, it's often like, oh, I just spent an hour trying to figure out why that wouldn't work, and it's because I had a typo in there. Awesome. It's great. It's an hour of my life I'll never get back. So hopefully I can help you identify that very quickly. So just look for things like that. Like, did you have a typo in there? Is a sign wrong in terms of greater than, less than, whatever? And then just always check and make sure everything worked in the way that you intended for it to work. Any other questions, either about the data, about any of the assignments, about the syllabus? I think I went over most of everything in the syllabus. I didn't go through the syllabus, week by week, but hopefully that should be fairly straightforward. Yeah. Any other questions, thoughts, needs? No? All right. Rachel, do you have a uterus on your arm? Thought so.
Yeah, I went to Afropunk this weekend and they had a booth.
Nice.
It's called Lady Parts, this organization, and they work to just promote reproductive rights, et cetera, et cetera. And so they were doing uterus tattoos. So,
Nice.
Of course, I had to get one.
Awesome. My friend just got, so she's going through infertility, and she's so excited because she has a picture of her uterus with the dye shot up in it now, and like posting it everywhere and sending it everywhere. She's like, look at my uterus. Actually pretty cool. All right, I'll give you that. So, yeah.
Nice.
All right, any other questions, thoughts, needs? No? All right. Well, we'll end there for tonight, and then just start playing with your data, start working through it, lean on each other, let me know if you have questions, send me syntax if you need help with things, and we'll go from there.
Thank you.
All right. Awesome. Happy
Have a good night.
holiday weekend for those of you who might have a slightly longer weekend this weekend, maybe. Good luck if you do.